thought was that she had lost 90 pounds. She hadn't, of course. If she'd lost that much weight, she hardly would have been there at all. But that was my brain's initial reaction to what my eyes were reporting. Her face had fallen away to show the shape of the underlying skull, and her skin was as white as parchment. There were dark circles under her eyes, and it was the first time I ever saw her in her rocker when she didn't have a lap full of sewing or Afghan squares or rags for braiding into a rug. She was just sitting there, like a person in a train station. "Melinda," my wife said warmly. I think she was as shocked as I was, more, perhaps. But she hid it splendidly, as some women seem able to do. She went to Melinda, dropped on one knee beside the rocking chair in which the warden's wife sat, and took one of her hands. As she did, my eye happened upon the blue hearthrug by the fireplace. It occurred to me that it should have been the shade of tired old limes, because now this room was just another version of the Green Mile. "I brought you some tea," Jan said. "The kind I put up myself. It's a nice, sleepy tea. I've left it in the kitchen." "Thank you so much, darling," Melinda said. Her voice sounded old and rusty. "How you feeling, dear?" my wife asked. "Better," Melinda said in her rusty, grating voice. "Not so's I want to go out to a barn dance, but at least there's no pain today. They give me some pills for the headaches. Sometimes they even work." "That's good, isn't it?" "But I can't grip so well. Something's happened to my hand." She raised it, looked at it as if she had never seen it before, and lowered it back into her lap. "Something's happened all over me." She began to cry in a soundless way that made me think of John Coffey. It started to chime in my head again, that thing he'd said. "I helped it, didn't I? I helped it, didn't I?" Like a rhyme you can't get rid of. Hal came in then. He collared me, and you can believe me when I say I was glad to be collared. We went into the kitchen, and he poured me half a shot of white whiskey, hot stuff, fresh out of some countryman's still. We clinked our glasses together and drank. The shine went down like coal oil, but the bloom in the belly was heaven. Still, when Moores tipped the mason jar at me, wordlessly asking if I wanted the other half, I shook my head and waved it off. Wild Bill Wharton was out of restraints, for the time being anyway, and it wouldn't be safe to go near where he was with a booze-clouded head, not even with bars between us. "I don't know how long I can take this, Paul," he said in a low voice. "There's a girl who comes in mornings to help me with her, but the doctors say she may lose control of her bowels, and—" He stopped, his throat working, trying hard not to cry in front of me again. "Go with it as best you can," I said. I reached out across the table and briefly squeezed his palsied, liver-spotted hand. "Do that day by day, and give the rest over to God. There's nothing else you can do, is there?" "I guess not. But it's hard, Paul. I pray you never have to find out how hard." He made an effort to collect himself. "Now tell me the news. How you doing with William Wharton, and how you making out with Percy Wetmore?" We talked shop for a while and got through the visit. After, all the way home, with my wife sitting silent for the most part, wet-eyed and thoughtful in the passenger seat beside me, Coffey's words ran around in my head like Mr. Jingles running around in Delacroix's cell. "I helped it, didn't I?" "It's terrible," my wife said dully at one point. "And there's nothing anyone can do to help her." I nodded agreement and thought, I helped it, didn't I? But that was crazy, and I tried as best I could to put it out of my mind. As we turned into our dooryard, she finally spoke a second time, not about her old friend Melinda, but about my urinary infection. She wanted to know if it was really gone. Really gone, I told her, cured. That's fine, then, she said, and kissed me over the eyebrow in that shivery place of mine. Maybe we ought to, get up to a little something, if you have the time and the inclination, that is. Having plenty of the latter and just enough of the former, I took her by the hand and led her into the back bedroom and took her clothes off as she stroked the part of me that swelled and throbbed but didn't hurt any more. And as I moved in her sweetness, slipping through it in that slow way she liked, that we both liked, I thought of John Coffey, saying he'd helped it. He'd helped it, hadn't he? Like a snatch of song that won't leave your mind until it's damned good and ready. Later, as I drove to the prison, I got to thinking that very soon we would have to start rehearsing for Delacroix's execution. That thought led to how Percy was going to be out front this time, and I felt a shiver of dread. I told myself to just go with it. One execution, and we'd very likely be shut of Percy Wetmore for good, but still I felt that shiver, as if the infection I'd been suffering with wasn't gone at all, but had only switched locations, from boiling my groin to freezing my backbone. Chapter 7. "Come on," Brutal told Delacroix the following evening. "We're going for a little walk, you and me and Mr. Jingles." Delacroix looked at him distrustfully, then reached down into the cigar box for the mouse. He cupped it in the palm of one hand and looked at Brutal with narrow eyes. "What you talking about?" "It's a big night for you and Mr. Jingles," Dean said, as he and Harry joined Brutal. The chain of bruises around Dean's neck had gone an unpleasant yellow color, but at least he could talk again without sounding like a dog barking at a cat. He looked at Brutal. "Think we ought to put the shackles on him, Brute?" Brutal appeared to consider. "No," he said at last. "He's gonna be good, ain't you, Del? You and the mouse both. After all, you're gonna be showing off with some high muckamucks tonight." Percy and I were standing up by the duty desk watching this, Percy with his arms folded and a small, contemptuous smile on his lips. After a bit he took out his horn comb and went to work on his hair with it. John Coffey was watching too, standing silently at the bars of his cell. Wharton was lying on his bunk, staring up at the ceiling and ignoring the whole show. He was still being good, although what he called good was what the docs at Briar Ridge called catatonic. And there was one other person there as well. He was tucked out of sight in my office, but his skinny shadow fell out the door and onto the Green Mile. "What this about, you gonfoo?" Del asked querulously, drawing his feet up on the bunk as Brutal undid the double locks on his cell door and ran it open. His eyes flicked back and forth among the three of them. "Well, I'll tell you," Brutal said. "Mr. Moores is gone for a while. His wife is under the weather, as you may have heard, so Mr. Anderson is in charge, Mr. Curtis Anderson." "Yeah? What that got to do with me?" "Well," Harry said, "Boss Anderson's heard about your mouse, Del, and wants to see him perform. He and about 6 other fellows are over in admin, just waiting for you to show up. Not just plain old blue-suit guards, either. These are pretty big bugs, just like Brute said. One of them, I believe, is a politician all the way from the state capitol." Delacroix swelled visibly at this, and I saw not so much as a single shred of doubt on his face. Of course they wanted to see Mr. Jingles, who would not? He scrummed around, first under his bunk and then under his pillow. He eventually found one of those big pink peppermints and the wildly colored spool. He looked at Brutal questioningly, and Brutal nodded. "Yep, it's the spool trick they're really wild to see, I guess. But the way he eats those mints is pretty damn cute, too. And don't forget the cigar box. You'll want it to carry him in, right?" Delacroix got the box and put Mr. Jingles' props in it, but the mouse he settled on the shoulder of his shirt. Then he stepped out of his cell, his puffed-out chest leading the way, and regarded Dean and Harry. "You boys coming?" "No," Dean said. "Got other fish to fry. But you knock 'em for a loop, Del. Show 'em what happens when a Louisiana boy puts the hammer down and really goes to work." "You bet." A smile shone out of his face, so sudden and so simple in its happiness that I felt my heart break for him a little, in spite of the terrible thing he had done. What a world we live in. What a world. Delacroix turned to John Coffey, with whom he had struck up a diffident friendship, not much different from 100 other death-house acquaintances I'd seen. "You knock 'em for a loop, Del," Coffey said in a serious voice. "You show 'em all his tricks." Delacroix nodded and held his hand up by his shoulder. Mr. Jingles stepped onto it like it was a platform, and Delacroix held the hand out toward Coffey's cell. John Coffey stuck out a huge finger, and I'll be damned if that mouse didn't stretch out his neck and lick the end of it just like a dog. "Come on, Del, quit lingering," Brutal said. "These folks are setting back a hot dinner at home to watch your mouse cut his capers." Not true, of course. Anderson would have been there until 8 o'clock on any night, and the guards he'd dragged in to watch Delacroix's show would be there until 11 or 12, depending on when their shifts were scheduled to end. The politician from the state capital would most likely turn out to be an office janitor in a borrowed tie. But Delacroix had no way of knowing any of that. "I'm ready," Delacroix said, speaking with the simplicity of a great star who has somehow managed to retain the common touch. "Let's go." And as Brutal led him up the Green Mile, with Mr. Jingles perched there on the little man's shoulder, Delacroix once more began to bugle, "Messieurs et mesdames, bienvenue au Cirque de Moussy." Yet, even lost as deeply in his own fantasy world as he was, he gave Percy a wide berth and a mistrustful glance. Harry and Dean stopped in front of the empty cell across from Wharton's. That worthy had still not so much as stirred. They watched as Brutal unlocked the door to the exercise yard, where another 2 guards were waiting to join him, and led Delacroix out, bound for his command performance before the grand high poobahs of Cold Mountain Penitentiary. We waited until the door was locked again, and then I looked toward my office. That shadow was still lying on the floor, thin as famine, and I was glad Delacroix had been too excited to see it. "Come on out," I said, "and let's move along brisk, folks. I want to get 2 run-throughs in, and we don't have much time." Old Toot-Toot, looking as bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as ever, came out, walked to Delacroix's cell, and strolled in through the open door. "Sitting down," he said. "I'm sitting down, I'm sitting down, I'm sitting down." This is the real circus, I thought, closing my eyes for a second. This is the real circus right here, and we're all just a bunch of trained mice. Then I put the thought out of my mind, and we started to rehearse. Chapter 8. The first rehearsal went well, and so did the second. Percy performed better than I could have hoped for in my wildest dreams. That didn't mean things would go right when the time really came for the Cajun to walk the mile, but it was a big step in the right direction. It occurred to me that it had gone well because Percy was at long last doing something he cared about. I felt a surge of contempt at that and pushed it away. What did it matter? He would cap Delacroix and roll him, and then both of them would be gone. If that wasn't a happy ending, what was? And as Moores had pointed out, Delacroix's nuts were going to fry no matter who was out front. Still, Percy had shown to good advantage in his new role, and he knew it. We all did. As for me, I was too relieved to dislike him much, at least for the time being. It looked as if things were going to go all right. I was further relieved to find that Percy actually listened when we suggested some things he could do that might improve his performance even more, or at least cut down the possibility of something going wrong. If you want to know the truth, we got pretty enthusiastic about it. Even Dean, who ordinarily stood well back from Percy, physically as well as mentally, if he could. None of it that surprising either, I suppose. For most men, nothing is more flattering than having a young person actually pay attention to his advice, and we were no different in that regard. As a result, not a one of us noticed that Wild Bill Wharton was no longer looking up at the ceiling. That includes me, but I know he wasn't. He was looking at us as we stood there by the duty desk, gassing and giving Percy advice. Giving him advice, and him pretending to listen. Quite a laugh, considering how things turned out. The sound of a key rattling into the lock of the door to the exercise yard put an end to our little post-rehearsal critique. Dean gave Percy a warning glance. "Not a word or a wrong look," he said. "We don't want him to know what we've been doing. It's not good for him. Upsets him." Percy nodded and ran a finger across his lips in a mums-the-word gesture that was supposed to be funny and wasn't. The exercise yard door opened and Delacroix came in, escorted by Brutal, who was carrying the cigar box with a colored spool in it the way the magician's assistant in a vaudeville show might carry the boss's props off stage at the end of the act. Mr. Jingles was perched on Delacroix's shoulder. And Delacroix himself? I tell you what, Lily Langtry couldn't have looked any glowier after performing at the White House. "They love Mr. Jingles," Delacroix proclaimed. "They laugh and cheer and clap their hands." "Well, that's aces," Percy said. He spoke in an indulgent, proprietary way that didn't sound like the old Percy at all. "Pop on back in your cell, old-timer." Delacroix gave him a comical look of distrust, and the old Percy came busting out. He bared his teeth in a mock snarl and made as if to grab Delacroix. It was a joke, of course. Percy was happy, not in a serious grabbing mood at all, but Delacroix didn't know that. He jerked away with an expression of fear and dismay and tripped over one of Brutal's big feet. He went down hard, hitting the linoleum with the back of his head. Mr. Jingles leaped away in time to avoid being crushed and went squeaking off down the Green Mile to Delacroix's cell. Delacroix got to his feet, gave the chuckling Percy a single hate-filled glance, then scurried off after his pet, calling for him and rubbing the back of his head. Brutal, who didn't know that Percy had shown exciting signs of actually doing his job for a change, gave Percy a wordless look of contempt and went after Del, shaking his keys out. I think what happened next happened because Percy was actually moved to apologize. I know it's hard to believe, but he was in an extraordinary humor that day. If true, it only proves a cynical old adage I heard once, something about how no good deed goes unpunished. Remember me telling you about how, after he'd chased the mouse down to the restraint room on one of those 2 occasions before Delacroix joined us, Percy got a little too close to the Prez's cell? Doing that was dangerous, which was why the Green Mile was so wide. When you walked straight down the middle of it, you couldn't be reached from the cells. The Prez hadn't done anything to Percy, but I remember thinking that Arlen Bitterbuck might have, had it been him Percy had gotten too close to, just to teach him a lesson. Well, the Prez and the Chief had both moved on, but Wild Bill Wharton had taken their place. He was worse-mannered than the Prez or the Chief had ever dreamed of being, and he'd been watching the whole little play, hoping for a chance to get on stage himself. That chance now fell into his lap, courtesy of Percy Wetmore. "Hey, Del!" Percy called, half laughing, starting after Brutal and Delacroix and drifting much too close to Wharton's side of the Green Mile without realizing it. "Hey, you numb shit! I didn't mean nothing by it. Are you all right?" Wharton was up off his bunk and over to the bars of his cell in a flash. Never in my time as a guard did I see anyone move so fast, and that includes some of the athletic young men Brutal and I worked with later at Boys Correctional. He shot his arms out through the bars and grabbed Percy, first by the shoulders of his uniform blouse and then by the throat. Wharton dragged him back against his cell door. Percy squealed like a pig in a slaughter chute, and I saw from his eyes that he thought he was going to die. "Ain't you sweet?" Wharton whispered. One hand left Percy's throat and ruffled through his hair. "Soft," he said, half laughing, "like a girl's. I'd rather fuck your asshole than your sister's pussy, I think." And he actually kissed Percy's ear. I think Percy who had beat Delacroix onto the block for accidentally brushing his crotch, remember, knew exactly what was happening. I doubt that he wanted to, but I think he did. All the color had drained from his face, and the blemishes on his cheeks stood out like birthmarks. His eyes were huge and wet. A line of spittle leaked from one corner of his twitching mouth. All this happened quick. It was begun and done in less than 10 seconds, I'd say. Harry and I stepped forward, our billies raised. Dean drew his gun. But before things could go so much as an inch further, Wharton let go of Percy and stepped back, raising his hands to his shoulders and grinning his dank grin. "I let him go. I was just playing, and I let him go," he said. "Never hurt every single hair in that boy's pretty head, so don't you go sticking me down that goddamn soft room again." Percy Wetmore darted across the Green Mile and cringed against the barred door of the empty cell on the other side, breathing so fast and so loud that it sounded almost like sobbing. He had finally gotten his lesson in keeping to the center of the Green Mile and away from the frumious Bandersnatch, the teeth that bite and the claws that catch. I had an idea it was a lesson that would stick with him longer than all the advice we'd given him after our rehearsals. There was an expression of utter terror on his face, and his precious hair was seriously mussed up for the first time since I'd met him, all in spikes and tangles. He looked like someone who has just escaped being raped. There was a moment of utter stop, then, a quiet so thick that the only sound was the sobbing whistle of Percy's breathing. What broke it was cackling laughter, so sudden and so completely its own mad thing that it was shocking. Wharton was my first thought. But it wasn't him. It was Delacroix, standing in the open door of his cell and pointing at Percy. The mouse was back on his shoulder, and Delacroix looked like a small but malevolent male witch, complete with imp. "Look at him, he done piss his pants!" Delacroix howled. "Look at what the big man done! Boss other people with his stick, maybe. Some mauvais homme, but when someone touch him, he make water in his pants just like a baby." He laughed and pointed, all his fear and hatred of Percy coming out in that derisive laughter. Percy stared at him, seemingly incapable of moving or speaking. Wharton stepped back to the bars of his cell, looked down at the dark splotch on the front of Percy's trousers. It was small, but it was there, and no question about what it was, and grinned. "Somebody ought to buy the tough boy a daddy," he said, and went back to his bunk, chuffing laughter. Brutal went down to Delacroix's cell, but the Cajun had ducked inside and thrown himself on his bunk before Brutal could get there. I reached out and grasped Percy's shoulder. "Percy," I began, but that was as far as I got. He came to life, shaking my hand off. He looked down at the front of his pants, saw the spot spreading there, and blushed a dark, fiery red. He looked up at me again, then at Harry and Dean. I remember being glad that old Toot-Toot was gone. If he'd been around, the story would have been all over the prison in a single day. And given Percy's last name, an unfortunate one in this context, it was a story that would have been told with the relish of high glee for years to come. "You talk about this to anyone, and you'll all be on the breadlines in a week," he whispered fiercely. It was the sort of crack that would have made me want to swat him under other circumstances. But under these, I only pitied him. I think he saw that pity, and it made it worse with him, like having an open wound scoured with nettles. "What goes on here stays here," Dean said quietly. "You don't have to worry about that." Percy looked back over his shoulder toward Delacroix's cell. Brutal was just locking the door, and from inside, deadly clear, we could still hear Delacroix giggling. Percy's look was as black as thunder. I thought of telling him that you reaped what you sowed in this life, and then decided this might not be the right time for a scripture lesson. "As for him," he began, but never finished. He left instead, head down, to go into the storage room and look for a dry pair of pants. "He's so pretty," Wharton said in a dreamy voice. Harry told him to shut the fuck up before he went down to the restraint room just on general damned principles. Wharton folded his arms on his chest, closed his eyes, and appeared to go to sleep. Chapter 9. The night before Delacroix's execution came down hotter and muggier than ever. 81 degrees by the thermometer outside the admin ready room when I clocked in at 6. 81 degrees at the end of October, think of that. And thunder rumbling in the west like it does in July. I'd met a member of my congregation in town that afternoon, and he had asked me with apparent seriousness if I thought such unseasonable weather could be a sign of the last times. I said that I was sure not. But it crossed my mind that it was last times for Edouard Delacroix, all right. Yes, indeed it was. Bill Dodge was standing in the door to the exercise yard, drinking coffee and smoking him a little smoke. He looked around at me and said, "Well, look at here, Paul Edgecombe, big as life and twice as ugly." "How'd the day go, Billy?" "All right." "Delacroix?" "Fine. He seems to understand it's tomorrow, and yet it's like he don't understand. You know how most of 'em are when the end finally comes for 'em." I nodded. "Wharton?" Bill laughed. "What a comedian. Makes Jack Benny sound like a Quaker. He told Rolf Wettermark that he ate strawberry jam out of his wife's pussy." "What did Rolf say?" "That he wasn't married, said it must have been his mother Wharton was thinking of." I laughed, and hard. That really was funny, in a low sort of way. And it was good just to be able to laugh without feeling like someone was lighting matches way down low in my gut. Bill laughed with me, then turned the rest of his coffee out in the yard, which was empty except for a few shuffling trustees, most of whom had been there for 1,000 years or so. Thunder rumbled somewhere far off, and unfocused heat lightning flashed in the darkening sky overhead. Bill looked up uneasily, his laughter dying. "I'll tell you what, though," he said. "I don't like this weather much. Feels like something's going to happen, something bad." About that he was right. The bad thing happened right around 10:15 that night. That was when Percy killed Mr. Jingles. Chapter 10. At first it seemed like it was going to be a pretty good night, in spite of the heat. John Coffey was being his usual quiet self, Wild Bill was making out to be Mild Bill, and Delacroix was in good spirits for a man who had a date with old Sparky in a little more than 24 hours. He did understand what was going to happen to him, at least on the most basic level. He had ordered chili for his last meal, and gave me special instructions for the kitchen. "Tell him to lay on that hot sauce," he said. "Tell him the kind that really jump up your throat and say howdy. The green stuff, none of that mild. That stuff gripe me like a motherfucker. I can't get off the toilet the next day. But I don't think I'm going to have a problem this time, n'est-ce pas?" Most of them worry about their immortal souls with a kind of moronic ferocity. But Delacroix pretty much dismissed my questions about what he wanted for spiritual comfort in his last hours. If that fella, Schuster, had been good enough for Big Chief Bitterbuck, Del reckoned Schuster would be good enough for him. No, what he cared about, you've guessed already, I'm sure, was what was going to happen to Mr. Jingles after he, Delacroix, passed on. I was used to spending long hours with the condemned on the night before their last march, but this was the first time I'd spent those long hours pondering the fate of a mouse. Del considered scenario after scenario, patiently working the possibilities through his dim mind. And while he thought aloud, wanting to provide for his pet mouse's future as if it were a child that had to be put through college, he threw that colored spool against the wall. Each time he did it, Mr. Jingles would spring after it, track it down, and then roll it back to Del's foot. It started to get on my nerves after a while, First the clack of the spool against the stone wall, then the minute clitter of Mr. Jingle's paws. Although it was a cute trick, it palled after 90 minutes or so, and Mr. Jingles never seemed to get tired. He paused every now and then to refresh himself with a drink of water out of a coffee saucer Delacroix kept for just that purpose, or to munch a pink crumb of peppermint candy, and then back to it he went. Several times it was on the tip of my tongue to tell Delacroix to give it a rest, and each time I reminded myself that he had this night and tomorrow to play the spool game with Mr. Jingles, and that was all. Near the end, though, it began to be really difficult to hold on to that thought. You know how it is with a noise that's repeated over and over like that. After a while it shoots your nerve. I started to speak, after all. Then something made me look over my shoulder and out the cell door. John Coffey was standing at his cell door across the way, and he shook his head at me. Right, left, back to center, as if he had read my mind and was telling me to think again. I would see that Mr. Jingles got to Delacroix's maiden aunt, I said, the one who had sent him the big bag of candy. His colored spool could go as well, even his house. We'd take up a collection and see that Toot gave up his claim on the Corona box. No, said Delacroix, after some consideration. He had time to throw the spool against the wall at least 5 times, with Mr. Jingles either nosing it back or pushing it with his paws. That wouldn't do. Aunt Hermione was too old. She wouldn't understand Mr. Jingles' frisky ways. And suppose Mr. Jingles outlived her? What would happen to him then? No. Aunt Hermione just wouldn't do. Well, then, I asked, suppose one of us took it, one of us guards. We could keep him right here on E-Block. No, Delacroix said. He thanked me kindly for the thought, certainement, but Mr. Jingles was a mouse that yearned to be free. He, Edouard Delacroix, knew this because Mr. Jingles had, you guessed it, whispered the information in his ear. All right, I said, one of us will take him home, Del. Dean, maybe. He's got a little boy that would just love a pet mouse, I bet. Delacroix actually turned pale with horror at the thought. A little kid in charge of a rodent genius like Mr. Jingles? How in the name of le bon Dieu could a little kid be expected to keep up with his training, let alone teach him new tricks? And suppose the kid lost interest and forgot to feed him for 2 or 3 days at a stretch? Delacroix, who had roasted 6 human beings alive in an effort to cover up his original crime, shuddered with the delicate revulsion of an ardent anti-vivisectionist. All right, I said I'd take him myself. Promise them anything, remember, in their last 48 hours, promise them anything. How would that be? No, sir, Boss Edgecombe, Del said apologetically. He threw the spool again. It hit the wall, bounced, spun, then Mr. Jingles was on it like white on rice and nosing it back to Delacroix. Thank you kindly, merci beaucoup, but you live out in the woods, and Mr. Jingles he be scared to live out dans la forêt. I know because— I think I can guess how you know, Del, I said. Delacroix nodded, smiling. But we're gonna figure this out, you bet. He threw the spool. Mr. Jingles clittered after it. I tried not to wince. In the end it was Brutal who saved the day. He had been up by the duty desk watching Dean and Harry play cribbage. Percy was there too, and Brutal finally tired of trying to start a conversation with him and getting nothing but sullen grunts in response. He strolled down to where I sat on a stool outside of Delacroix's cell and stood there listening to us with his arms folded. "How about Mouseville?" Brutal asked into the considering silence which followed Dell's rejection of my spooky old house out in the woods. He threw the comment out in a casual, just-an-idea tone of voice. "Mouseville?" Delacroix asked, giving Brutal a look both startled and interested. "What Mouseville?" "It's this tourist attraction down in Florida," he said. "Tallahassee, I think. Is that right, Paul? Tallahassee?" "Yep," I said, speaking without a moment's hesitation, thinking God bless Brutus Howell. "Tallahassee, right down the road a piece from the Dog University." Brutal's mouth twitched at that, and I thought he was going to spoil the pitch by laughing, but he got it under control and nodded. I'd hear about the dog university later, though, I imagined. This time Dell didn't throw the spool, although Mr. Jingles stood on Dell's slipper with his front paws raised, clearly lusting for another chance to chase. The Cajun looked from Brutal to me and back to Brutal again. "What they do in Mouseville?" he asked. "You think they'd take Mr. Jingles?" Brutal asked me, simultaneously ignoring Dell and drawing him on. "Think he's got the stuff, Paul?" I tried to appear considering. "You know," I said, "the more I think of it, the more it seems like a brilliant idea." From the corner of my eye, I saw Percy come part way down the Green Mile, giving Wharton's cell a very wide berth. He stood with one shoulder leaning against an empty cell, listening with a small, contemptuous smile on his lips. "What is Mouseville?" Dell asked, now frantic to know. "A tourist attraction, like I told you," Brutal said. "There's, I don't know, 100 or so mice there, wouldn't you say, Paul?" "More like 150 these days," I said. "It's a big success. I understand they're thinking of opening one out in California and calling it Mouseville West. That's how much business is booming. Trained mice are the coming thing with a smart set, I guess. I don't understand it myself." Percy sat with the colored spool in his hand, looking at us, his own situation forgotten for the time being. "They only take the smartest mice," Brutal cautioned. "The ones that can do tricks. And they can't be white mice because those are pet shop mice." "Pet shop mice, yeah, you bet," Delacroix said fiercely. "I hate them pet shop mice." "And what they got," Brutal said, his eyes distant now as he imagined it, "is this tent you go into." Yeah, like in a cirque. Do you got to pay to get in?" "You shitting me? Of course you got to pay to get in. A dime apiece, 2 cents for the kiddies. And there's like this whole city made out of Bakelite boxes and toilet paper rolls and windows made out of isinglass so you can see what they're up to in there." Yeah. Delacroix was in ecstasy now. Then he turned to me. "What, ivy glass?" "Like on the front of a stove where you can see in?" I said. "Oh, sure, that shit." He cranked his hand at Brutal, wanting him to go on, and Mr. Jingle's little oil-drop eyes practically spun in their sockets, trying to keep that spool in view. It was pretty funny. Percy came a little closer, as if wanting to get a better look, and I saw John Coffey frowning at him, but I was too wrapped up in Brutal's fantasy to pay much attention. This took telling the condemned man what he wanted to hear to new heights, and I was all admiration, believe me. "Well," Brutal said, "there's the Mouse City, but what the kids really like is the Mouseville All-Star Circus, where there's mice that swing on trapezes, and mice that roll these little barrels, and mice that stack coins." "Yeah, that's it. That's the place for Mr. Jingles," Delacroix said. His eyes sparkled and his cheeks were high with color. It occurred to me that Brutus Howell was a kind of saint. "You going to be a circus mouse after all, Mr. Jingles? Going to live in a mouse city down Florida, all ivy glass windows, hurrah!" He threw the spool extra hard. It hit low on the wall, took a crazy bounce, and squirted out between the bars of his cell door and onto the mile. Mr. Jingles raced out after it, and Percy saw his chance. "No, you fool!" Brutal yelled, but Percy paid no attention. Just as Mr. Jingles reached the spool, too intent on it to realize his old enemy was at hand, Percy brought the sole of one hard black work shoe down on it. There was an audible snap as Mr. Jingles' back broke, and blood gushed from his mouth. His tiny dark eyes bulged in their sockets, and in them I read an expression of surprised agony that was all too human. Delacroix screamed with horror and grief. He threw himself at the door of his cell and thrust his arms out between the bars, reaching as far as he could, crying the mouse's name over and over. Percy turned toward him, smiling, toward the three of us. "There," he said. "I knew I'd get him. Sooner or later. Just a matter of time, really." He turned and walked back up the Green Mile, not hurrying, leaving Mr. Jingles lying on the linoleum in a spreading pool of his own blood.
Part 4. The Bad Death of Edouard Delacroix.
Chapter 1. All this other writing aside, I've kept a little diary since I took up residence at Georgia Pines. No big deal, just a couple of paragraphs a day, mostly about the weather, and I looked back through it last evening. I wanted to see just how long it has been since my grandchildren, Christopher and Danielle, more or less forced me into Georgia Pines. "For your own good, Gramps," they said. Of course they did. Isn't that what people mostly say when they have finally figured out how to get rid of a problem that walks and talks? It's been a little over 2 years. The eerie thing is that I don't know if it feels like 2 years, or longer than that, or shorter. My sense of time seems to be melting like a kid's snowman in a January thaw. It's as if time as it always was, Eastern Standard Time, Daylight Saving Time, Working Man Time, doesn't exist anymore. Here there is only Georgia Pines Time, which is Old Man Time, Old Lady Time, and Piss the Bed Time. The rest, all gone. This is a dangerous, damned place. You don't realize it at first. At first you think it's only a boring place, about as dangerous as a nursery school at nap time, but it's dangerous all right. I've seen a lot of people slide into senility since I came here, and sometimes they do more than slide. Sometimes they go down with the speed of a crash-diving submarine. They come here mostly all right, dim-eyed and welded to the cane, maybe a little loose in the bladder, but otherwise okay, and then something happens to them. A month later, they're just sitting in the TV room, staring up at Oprah Winfrey on the TV with dull eyes, a slack jaw, and a forgotten glass of orange juice tilted and dribbling in one hand. A month after that, you have to tell them their kids' names when the kids come to visit. And a month after that, it's their own damn names you have to refresh them on. Something happens to them, all right. Georgia Pines time happens to them. Time here is like a weak acid that erases first memory and then the desire to go on living. You have to fight it. That's what I tell Elaine Connolly, my special friend. It's gotten better for me since I started writing about what happened to me in 1932, the year John Coffey came on the Green Mile. Some of the memories are awful, but I can feel them sharpening my mind and my awareness the way a knife sharpens a pencil, and that makes the pain worthwhile. Writing and memory alone aren't enough, though. I also have a body, wasted and grotesque though it may now be, and I exercise it as much as I can. It was hard at first. Old fogies like me aren't much shakes when it comes to exercise just for the sake of exercise. But it's easier now that there's a purpose to my walks. I go out before breakfast, as soon as it's light most days, for my first stroll. It was raining this morning, and the damp makes my joints ache, but I hooked a poncho from the rack by the kitchen door and went out anyway. When a man has a chore, he has to do it, and if it hurts, too bad. Besides, there are compensations. The chief one is keeping that sense of real time as opposed to Georgia Pines time. And I like the rain, aches or no aches, especially in the early morning when the day is young and seems full of possibilities, even to a washed-up old boy like me. I went through the kitchen, stopping to beg 2 slices of toast from one of the sleepy-eyed cooks, and then went out. I crossed the croquet course, then the weedy little putting green. Beyond that is a small stand of woods, with a narrow path winding through it and a couple of sheds no longer used and mouldering away quietly along the way. I walked down this path slowly, listening to the sleek and secret patter of the rain in the pines, chewing away at a piece of toast with my few remaining teeth. My legs ached, but it was a low ache, manageable. Mostly I felt pretty well. I drew the moist gray air as deep as I could, taking it in like food. And when I got to the second of those old sheds, I went in for a while, and I took care of my business there. When I walked back up the path 20 minutes later, I could feel a worm of hunger stirring in my belly, and thought I could eat something a little more substantial than toast. A dish of oatmeal, perhaps even a scrambled egg with a sausage on the side. I love sausage, always have. But if I eat more than one these days, I'm apt to get the squitters. One would be safe enough, though. Then, with my belly full and with the damp air still perking up my brain, or so I hoped, I would go up to the solarium and write about the execution of Edouard Delacroix. I would do it as fast as I could, so as not to lose my courage. It was Mr. Jingles I was thinking about as I crossed the croquet courts to the kitchen door, how Percy Wetmore had stamped on him and broken his back, and how Delacroix had screamed when he realized what his enemy had done. And I didn't see Brad Dolan standing there, half hidden by the dumpster, until he reached out and grabbed my wrist. "Out for a little stroll, Polly?" he asked. I jerked back from him, yanking my wrist out of his hand. Some of it was just being startled. Anyone will jerk when they're startled, but that wasn't all of it. I'd been thinking about Percy Wetmore, remember, and it's Percy that Brad always reminds me of. Some of it's how Brad always goes around with a paperback stuffed into his pocket. With Percy, it was always a men's adventure magazine. With Brad, it's books of jokes that are only funny if you're stupid and mean-hearted. Some of it's how he acts like he's king shit of Turd Mountain, but mostly it's that he's sneaky and he likes to hurt. He'd just gotten to work, I saw. Hadn't even changed into his orderly's whites yet. He was wearing jeans and a cheesy-looking Western-style shirt. In one hand was the remains of a Danish he'd hooked out of the kitchen. He'd been standing under the eave, eating it where he wouldn't get wet. And where he could watch for me. I'm pretty sure of that now. I'm pretty sure of something else as well. I'll have to watch out for Mr. Brad Dolan. He doesn't like me much. I don't know why, but I never knew why Percy Wetmore didn't like Delacroix either. And dislike is really too weak a word. Percy hated Del's guts from the very first moment the little Frenchman came onto the Green Mile. "What's with this poncho you got on, Polly?" he asked, flicking the collar. "This isn't yours." "I got it in the hall outside the kitchen," I said. I hate it when he calls me Polly, and I think he knows it, but I was damned if I'd give him the satisfaction of seeing it. There's a whole row of 'em. I'm not hurting it any. Would you say rain's what it's made for, after all? "But it wasn't made for you, Polly," he said, giving it another little flick. "That's the thing. Those slickers are for the employees, not the residents." I still don't see what harm it does. He gave me a thin little smile. "It's not about harm. It's about the rules. What would life be without rules? Polly, Polly, Polly." He shook his head as if just looking at me made him feel sorry to be alive. "You probably think an old fart like you doesn't have to mind about the rules anymore, but that's just not true, Polly." Smiling at me. Disliking me, maybe even hating me. And why? I don't know. Sometimes there is no why. That's the scary part. "Well, I'm sorry if I broke the rules," I said. It came out sounding whiny, a little shrill, and I hated myself for sounding that way, but I'm old, and old people whine easily. Old people scare easily. Brad nodded. "Apology accepted. Now go hang that back up. You got no business out walking in the rain anyway, especially not in those woods. What if you were to slip and fall and break your damned hip, huh? Who do you think would have to hoss your freight back up the hill?" "I don't know," I said. I just wanted to get away from him. The more I listened to him, the more he sounded like Percy. William Wharton, the crazy man who came to the Green Mile in the fall of '32, once grabbed Percy and scared him so bad that Percy wet his pants. "You talk about this to anyone," Percy told the rest of us afterwards, "and you'll all be on the breadlines in a week." Now, these many years later, I could almost hear Brad Dolan saying those same words in that same tone of voice. It's as if by writing about those old times I have unlocked some unspeakable door that connects the past to the present. Percy Wetmore to Brad Dolan, Janice Edgecombe to Elaine Connolly, Cold Mountain State Prison to the Georgia Pines Old Folks Home. And if that thought doesn't keep me awake tonight, I guess nothing will. I made as if to go through the kitchen door, and Brad grabbed me by the wrist again. I don't know about the first one, but this time he was doing it on purpose, squeezing to hurt. His eyes shifting back and forth, making sure no one was around in the early morning wet, no one to see he was abusing one of the old folks he was supposed to be taking care of. "What do you do down that path?" he asked. "I know you don't go down there and jerk off. Those days are long behind you, so what do you do?" "Nothing," I said, telling myself to be calm, not to show him how bad he was hurting me, and to be calm, to remember he'd only mentioned the path. He didn't know about the shed. "I just walk, to clear my mind." "Too late for that, Paulie. Your mind's never going to be clear again." He squeezed my thin old man's wrist again, grinding the brittle bones, eyes continually shifting from side to side, wanting to make sure he was safe. Brad wasn't afraid of breaking the rules, he was only afraid of being caught breaking them. And in that, too, he was like Percy Wetmore, who would never let you forget he was the governor's nephew. "Old as you are, it's a miracle you can remember who you are. You're too goddamn old, even for a museum like this. You give me the fucking creeps, Paulie." "Let go of me," I said, trying to keep the whine out of my voice. It wasn't just pride, either. I thought if he heard it, it might inflame him, the way the smell of sweat can sometimes inflame a bad-tempered dog, one which would otherwise only growl, to bite. That made me think of a reporter who'd covered John Coffey's trial. The reporter was a terrible man named Hammersmith, and the most terrible thing about him was that he hadn't known he was terrible. Instead of letting go, Dolan squeezed my wrist again. I groaned. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. It hurt all the way down to my ankles. "What do you do down there, Polly? Tell me." "Nothing," I said. I wasn't crying, not yet, but I was afraid I'd start soon if he kept bearing down like that. "Nothing, I just walk. I like to walk. Let go of me." He did, but only long enough so he could grab my other hand. That one was rolled closed. "Open up," he said. "Let Papa see." I did, and he grunted with disgust. It was nothing but the remains of my second piece of toast. I clenched it in my right hand when he started squeezing my left wrist, and there was butter, well, oleo, they don't have real butter here, of course, on my fingers. "Go on inside and wash your damned hands," he said, stepping back and taking another bite of his Danish. "Jesus Christ." I went up the steps. My legs were shaking, my heart pounding like an engine with leaky valves and shaky old pistons. As I grasped the knob that would let me into the kitchen and safety, Dolan said, "If you tell anyone I squeezed your poor old wrist, Polly, I'll tell 'em you're having delusions. Onset of senile dementia, likely. And you know they'll believe me. If there are bruises, they'll think you made 'em yourself." Yes, those things were true. And once again it could have been Percy Wetmore saying them, a Percy that had somehow stayed young and mean while I'd grown old and brittle. "I'm not going to say anything to anyone," I muttered. "Got nothing to say." "That's right, you old sweetie." His voice light and mocking, the voice of a lagoon, to use Percy's word, who thought he was going to be young forever. "And I'm going to find out what you're up to. I'm gonna make it my business, you hear?" I heard all right, but wouldn't give him the satisfaction of saying so. I went in, passed through the kitchen — I could now smell eggs and sausage cooking, but no longer wanted any — and hung the poncho back up on its hook. Then I went upstairs to my room, resting at every step, giving my heart time to slow, and gathered my writing materials together. I went down to the solarium and was just sitting at the little table by the windows when my friend Elaine poked her head in. She looked tired, and I thought unwell. She'd combed her hair out, but was still in her robe. We old sweeties don't stand much on ceremony. For the most part, we can't afford to. "I won't disturb you," she said. "I see you're getting set to write."